Energy Minister Gwede Mantashe announcing the new preferred bidders to create more power for the grid. While green energy such as solar and wind are part of that mix, so are 3 power ships, massive vessels that will be parked offshore to generate power. This week in Parliament there was some criticism from the opposition and NGOs that it's a dirty source of power and that will be locked into contracts for 20 years. Let's speak now to the director of Karpowership SA, who will be bringing these ships to our shores, Seshaba Moletsani. Good evening, Mr. Moletsani, and thank you so much for joining us to give us more information. First of all, is this contract signed? Is it a done deal?
Thank you for having me. What we have received is what's called preferred bidder status. That means that from the bidding session, we were able to get through the first stage of this whole RMIPP program, which is to get preferred bidder. What we're doing now is going through all the permitting that is required and every other administrative aspect that is required for us to be able to sign contracts. So that's where we are now in the process of finalizing our environmentals, all the permits we need with all the ports where we are, and every other operating aspects that we require before we can sign the contracts.
So I think it's a good opportunity to ventilate the concerns as they are coming up. There have been quite a few concerns raised. I'm going to just run through some of the bigger ones. First of all, the criticism that it is not clean energy, that it is, well, it's certainly cleaner than diesel and coal, but it's not as clean as solar or wind. Do you acknowledge that?
Well, ma'am, I think the reality is it's not a question whether it's cleaner or clean as any other technology. I think what's important here to remember is that the RMIPP is a program that was part of what was detailed in the IRP, which is the Integrated Resource Plan of South Africa. This Integrated Resource Plan is what you would say is the Bible of South Africa. In that, this was basically taken through public stakeholder consultation for about 3 years, in which the fuel that we're using, which is liquid natural gas, is and was part of these public stakeholder consultations and was approved by all the environmentalists that were part of the stakeholder consultation, and as such was then included as an energy mix that is part of the South African energy mix. So I believe that the more important thing to not forget is that it is something that has been approved by our public and our government.
Yeah, so
and that is all we have done is adhere to that and use that
But still, in terms of looking at the emissions, it's certainly not as clean as your very clean options such as wind and solar. But nevertheless, and my understanding is it's seen as a bit of a sort of an interim, a transitional type of power, because it's certainly a step better than coal.
That is true. I mean, LNG is what is globally seen as a transition fuel for what we consider to be base load power. The renewables, as clean as they are, unfortunately do not fulfill the requirements of what we call baseload power or what we would call mid-merit power. Now, this particular risk mitigation program is for such kind of power, where you want to have quite a lot of power dispatchable throughout the day. So LNG as a base or as a dispatchable fuel for our power is actually assisting the renewable program, because it allows for you to, what you do is stabilize the grid.
Yeah. Yes, which of course is one of the concerns as green power is still evolving. That brings me to the length of the contract. Is it 20 years?
Well, every one of the contracts that we've had in South Africa for independent power producers is actually 20 years. And the rationale behind that is it is allowing for all those that have taken the risk of developing these projects to be able to actually recoup their money. If we were not to do that, it becomes a very expensive exercise for government and eventually the citizens of South Africa. So the 20-year contract is part and parcel of what makes it attractive for every potential developer to be able to come in and actually be able to put this through the system.
I think the concern there, first of all, is about how costs might escalate, because the gas costs may well escalate. So even though you came in at a very reasonable bid price, through the years those costs might escalate and it becomes a bit of an albatross around our necks, if I'm going to use some sort of sea terminology or metaphors there. The other thing is that, as we were saying earlier, it is seen as an interim sort of power source. So surely within 10, 15 years, we might have alternative energy, green energy, that is more stable, that can fill into that base load, and we might not need these power ships, which are not as clean as the other alternatives. Do you see the concern about the 20-year contract?
Well, ma'am, actually, I think the converse is actually more dire. We have lost in excess as an economy more than 380 billion rands due to load shedding. If you look at that and you think of us going further and carrying on in the context that we're in, on the hope that there may be cleaner technologies that come, I think we're taking a chance with our economy and people's lives and people's jobs. This is, for me, the correct process that has been undertaken, and as such, I don't see how the 20-year contract or the interim nature that most people are saying this is, it isn't an interim measure. It's actually for longer.
Am I right that the beauty of this is it's kind of like a one-stop solution? It brings the technology to South Africa. There's these 2 or 3 ships that work together, and they basically plug into the grid, and your grid is suddenly filled with the power that it needs. It's a really sort of a self-contained solution. Am I right?
Well, what we would say is the power ships have the benefit of having been built and completed to exacting standards of the highest technology and latest technology in a dry dock, which means you do not have the risk of construction when you get to preferred bidder and you're now having to build once you sign your contracts. The contracting or the construction of these power stations on land takes much longer, as you've seen with what has happened in ours in South Africa. You have cost overruns, you have risk of actual construction delays. You don't have that with power ships. Power ships are already built. They are sold into an entity in South Africa that allows us to now go and deliver this energy to the South African public.
I can see the appeal, and my understanding is if all goes well for the contract stage, by July next year they'll be feeding power into our grid. Is that correct?
That is correct. If we have...
I have to ask you one last question. Sorry, and that's about jobs.
Okay.
Obviously, building it here would mean more jobs. You have said that there are going to be local jobs. How much, and they're going to be 3 power ships, how many jobs exactly will each power ship, how many jobs exactly, local jobs, will each power ship create?
Well, in total, ma'am, we will be creating in excess of 1,000 jobs.
Local jobs for each?
Local jobs across the program in terms of the ships that we have. These jobs are not just low-end jobs. We're talking about jobs where we are going to take all the people that we are taking on through an academy that gives them skills, accreditation that is globally accredited. Not only are we creating the academy in South Africa for all people to be party to, but we are also putting in 60 million rands per site per year towards social economic development in each of these sites per year and per site. We're also going to be spending 250 million plus per site per year on preferential procurement.
And how much are you going to be making a year? And I'll tell you why. I want to play a clip from Chris Yelland, who's quite critical, and he said something that will strike fear into the heart of every South African. So I want to play it for you, and then I want to give you a chance to respond. Let's take a listen to what Chris Yelland said.
They are manufactured abroad and they're brought here. The LNG is not made in South Africa. It's all imported. So virtually the entire costs of these projects is imported, and all the money goes out of South Africa. It's like e-tolls.
Sure.
It's simply money that is flowing out of South Africa. There's only a very small amount of money which is used for local operations and maintenance staff in South Africa.
Now that's a real fear. We've seen the mess of e-tolls. Is it like e-tolls?
Not at all, ma'am. I think this learned friend of ours needs to actually have a proper look at what he's saying, because every one of these ships, when they come here, the whole project is financed by South African banks. The ships are bought into South Africa and as such belong to South African entity, of which we are 49% shareholders. If you look at what's called project finance of these type of ventures, project finance is usually 80% debt and 20% equity. The 80% debt that we're talking about in this particular instance, which is what has bought these ships in, is actually all locally funded. That's our local banks have come to the party and are willing and are able to fund these projects. As such, even our equity is funded by our local banks. The only equity that is not funded by our local banks is actually that belongs to the Kara Dennis family, which is the 51% shareholder of the South African entity which the ships have been bought into. So there is no major exodus of money as someone is alluding to. It is not like that at all. And in terms of the fuel that he's talking about, our government has structured a very robust formula to ensure that you manage the risk of currency and of inflated pricing of the source or the raw material that is going to be used for the production of this power. So I do not agree with him at all. We've seen figures being bandied around of huge amounts of money, which we don't even know how they came to. So I would really love to know how they came up to that calculation and actually then say, well, this is how the calculation is done. And unfortunately, that is in the purview of the Department of Energy, who has actually seen all our financial models and actually awarded us all of this based on the least cost, least regret position of each of the bidders that have been awarded.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It was really interesting to hear from the people who are going to be bringing these ships. As you say, you are the preferred bidders. You've passed the first hurdle, but there's a few more hurdles to go. And it's good that we are taking a close look at all these contracts so it's done with complete transparency. So we don't have another e-toll on our hands. And thank you very much. We look forward to hearing how it progresses. That was the director of Karpowership South Africa. He'll be bringing the ships to our shores. Of course, these power ships will be flowing electricity into our grid as early as July if the contract is finalized. That was Sechaba Moletsani.